I'd like to introduce Dr. Glenn Ross Caddy, who is a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist in the state of Florida and in the state of New South Wales, Australia. Dr. Caddy is known for matters of high trauma, including cases involving traumatic injury, war crimes and torture, cult issues and mind control. In the latter in particular, Dr. Caddy has done a great deal of work in the area of parental alienation. He holds a diplomat and/or fellow status within the American Board of Clinical Psychology, the Behavior Therapy and Research Society, the International Academy of Behavioral Medicine, the American Academy of Clinical Psychology, the American Academy of Forensic Examiners, the International Academy of Eclectic Psychotherapy, and the American Board of Sexology. He consults for many organizations and many governmental and non-governmental institutions. Please welcome Dr. Glenn Ross Caddy.
Good morning, all. And thank you very much, Bill, for a great introductory presentation. My talk today is PAS and mind control, the idea of creating mental illness. And I posit that the conceptualization of PAS really follows very closely, in a number of respects, to conditions that have been known, as Bill has said, for a very long time. I came to this work, interestingly, in large measure because I was involved in some very interesting cases dealing with the impact of mind control in cults. Many of you, probably all of you, know about the Patty Hearst incident in the early 1970s, where she was captured by the Symbionese Liberation Army, and this 22-year-old young woman and heiress to the Hearst fortune, newspaper publishing fortune, ended up being involved in a bank robbery in which a woman died. Patty Hearst ultimately was pardoned by President Clinton after serving significant years in prison for her involvement in the crime, mind control. Another example, the Jamestown Massacre, Jim James. And that was described by certain FBI agents as one suicide and 1,033 murders. And of course, there are subsequent murders as a result of some of the investigative efforts of a congressman and certain other people. We can look at the Heaven's Gate event in San Francisco. Another situation where it was alleged that there was one suicide, and I think it was 42 or 43 murders. This was the event where a number of people decided that they were going to take massive quantities of alcohol and barbiturates. They dressed in black, they lay down on their beds, and they died. The purpose of this death was so that they would be carried up to a spaceship that was traveling in the trail of the Halley's Comet when it came close to Earth about 10 years ago. I think we would all agree that there's a bit of insanity, a bit of craziness. You can call it nuts, you can call it lots of things, but these people were functioning from profoundly disordered belief systems. I came to this work in parental alienation in no small measure as a result of having done significant work in several of these cases. And the craziness that follows from the capturing of the mind, the manipulation of the mind. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about two cases. One of them dealing with parental alienation, one of them having absolutely nothing directly to do with parental alienation at all, because I want to show the emergence of insanity in one case and the emergence of the capturing of the mind in another. Now, let me just say before I do that, that I'm also involved in a number of cases of dealing with PAS at the present time. And the only reason, in some respects, I think I'm being a little provocative, but the only reason that there's not more PAS is there aren't enough wealthy people to litigate PAS cases. Clearly, for every PAS case that finds itself into the courtroom, there are literally, I would suspect, thousands. And if Bill's numbers bear any truth, if 1%, and that doesn't seem to me to be an unreasonable number, even if it's 0.5%, I'm not sure that it makes all that much difference. The volume of people that we're talking about in the United States, with a population of 330 million. But it's not the United States. It's the United States. It's Canada. It's Australia, where I'm from. It's virtually every country in the world. I don't know anything about it with respect to some of the Muslim countries, for example. I don't know that any work has been done there, but I have no reason to believe that it's all that much different in those settings. In fact, in some respects, because of the nature of the cultures, it could be even more substantial. I have no idea. But what we are looking at is basically an international plague in the development of the emotional well-being of children. There's a case going on in Florida that I'm involved in at the present time. This case has involved a physician spending in excess of $400,000 over the last 11 years. There have been I think it's five, judges who have recused themselves in this case. Guess what? Still hasn't got to see his children. 11 years. Interestingly, in this particular case, and it's the mother who's the inducer in this instance, the mother who's provoked the alienation. 20 years before she married this man and had a second family, she did this previously with her first husband. Not only did she prevent a relationship, she moved twice, changed their social security numbers, faked it, changed their birth certificates, faked it, changed their names, faked it, introduced them to new school systems, and then eventually introduced them to the gentleman whose lawyers have eventually hired me. So we're not just looking at, minor little problems of everyday life. What ultimately happened is the husband in the first case, the two boys who became adult, ultimately found them. One was 15 and one was 19. He hadn't seen them in 10 years. Got them back actually relatively quickly because they were able to be persuaded that from all of the evidence, and they'd been having conflicts with their mother. She had not done a particularly good job of forcing the alignment. What she'd done is simply told them that he was hideous, that he was bad, he was this, that, and the other, and as young children, they bought into it. Now, one of those children, I know, one of the adult children now, is having massive emotional problems. I don't know about the other one. In the other thing I want to make a general point about is that we talk about parental alienation existing solely, or the terminology infers that a parent is necessarily the principal agent of the negative acts. Not always the case. Sometimes the parent plays a substantial role, and grandparents add a tremendous degree of intensity to the process. Sometimes it's not the parent. Sometimes it's grandparents. Sometimes it's a step-parent. The issues are that you can inject processes of cognitive alteration, mind control in relatively small children relatively easily. If a 22-year-old and a bunch of and a number of 40 adult people can be converted to some really stunning delusion by the influence of another person, why would we assume that children can't be so influenced to develop delusional presumptions about another person? In fact, they can. I'm going to talk about a case of familial dysfunction and the introduction of a process of insanity. I'm going to do that to give you a flavor outside of the scope of parental alienation to the processes that flow here. Now, for those of you here who are mental health professionals, please bear with me. I understand that you've had, no doubt, a number of these experiences, but perhaps not necessarily one or a number that are quite as pathological as this one. And for the rest of you, I hope you find the presentation of this particular case intriguing. The case involves I was initially hired back about 9 years ago on a murder. It was I was hired within 24 hours of the murder being committed, and within 60 hours of the murder being committed, I'd actually examined the person who had perpetrated the murder. The murder was of a 10-month baby. The death of the baby occurred as a result of the mother, a 22-year-old, very sweet, very nice, very intelligent young woman, initially placing the baby down on a stone floor in her parents' home, then picking the baby up, placing the baby harder. Third time, throwing the baby down. Fourth time, throwing the baby down. Eighth time, throwing the baby down. Ninth time, walking up a flight of stairs and throwing the baby again down to the ground. The event at home at the time was her younger sister, who heard the baby's cries and came rushing to the stairs and intervened at the last throw, after the last throw. Also home at the time was her de facto husband. She was 22, remember. He was 31. He was also her stepbrother. And she had been having sex with him since she was 13 years of age, and had been living with him since she was 16 years of age. Now, as you might be able to calculate the math, there was significant sexual abuse and criminal conduct that had been existent for a very long time in this relationship. I'm going to give you some history of the relationship to help you understand the dynamics that played out here and that led to the death of this baby. As a young girl, I'll call her Jennifer because that's what I called her in a publication that I'm producing for the American Journal of Family Therapy, in fact. Jennifer grew up in a family that had a lot of dysfunction in it. Her father was schizotypal personality disorder. He was very withdrawn. By the way, as a result of the work that I did in this legal case, I got to meet all of the players in tremendous detail. And so I've had personal experience with all of the parties that I'm talking about. The father was a loner. He was basically inept in his ability to relate to virtually anybody. He described himself as a man always in search of himself, and he attended an extremely, I'll simply call it an extremist Christian church, in which talking in tongues and the belief that God immediately, directly imposes himself in the life of people, that God speaks directly to people, and if they only listen, they will hear him. And we're talking about direct communication, not some much more ephemeral belief. He was also a man who was not able to maintain employment, was in many respects just out there. He met the woman who became his wife and the mother of Jennifer when he was 21 and she was 16. And she also attended that same church. Her mother was extremely controlling. She wanted to get away from her mother. She decided to escape and live with this young man. The net effect of that was over the next 10 years, they had 4 children. She was very intelligent. She was functional. She became a librarian. She worked hard. She got an undergraduate degree in liberal arts. And eventually, she went to work for an extremely wealthy family. She left her librarian role and went to work for an extremely wealthy family. At this point in time, they had 4 children, and she was fed up in the relationship. The only thing that they had in common to begin with was their religious convictions. But as time passed in the marriage, his religious convictions became so much more extreme, and his interest and her interest in being able to put it all together and constantly take care of one thing and another, while he did essentially nothing and provided no emotional support, led her to decide, you know what, I want out. Now she didn't, it was not until Jennifer, this young girl, was 12 years of age that they separated. But Jennifer's parents had lived separately, under the same roof separately for the last 4 years before that. What happened was that Jennifer was bright. She was devoted to her parents. She was devoted to both parents. But in the relationship that developed, she became the loved object of her pathological father. Her other siblings, the other 3, basically rejected Dad because he drank too much. He was really emotionally not there for them, and they didn't respect him. But there wasn't alienation as an induced event in that family, but there was splitting. There was splitting because Dad was just unable to maintain meaningful relationships with anybody, including his children, except his focus on Jennifer, above all else, was a commitment to God, he said, that he was going to make sure that Jennifer loved the Lord and understood God and heard from God just as he had. And so Jennifer, in fact, did attend church with her dad. She was Dad's little church-going buddy. and he injected a great deal of conviction in her about the power of his belief systems as far as they related to God. At age, when she was 13, her mother, who went to work for this wealthy family, wealthy in excess of $500 million, which is not irrelevant to the issues in this case. The relationship between the couple in this wealthy couple was very fragile. Eventually, the mother and the father in the wealthy couple began an affair. The affair led to a dissolution of their marriage and a connection between Jennifer's mother and the man who soon thereafter became her stepfather. Hope I'm not confusing it too much. Mother and stepfather's name for the purpose of this exercise is Peter. Peter had a very dysfunctional relationship with his super wealthy wife. They had 2 children. The youngest of those 2 children was Christopher. Christopher was mother's darling. The older boy was father's darling. Mother was extremely incompetent in her ability to manage the development of the process of raising her children. She was exceptionally laissez-faire. She set no limits at all. And Peter decided that he just couldn't deal with her, and so basically left the younger child to her, and he took care of the older child. Another form of splitting in a family system. End result, the older child did pretty well. Christopher became a disaster. He was a problem because he had some learning disabilities. He was a problem because he was hyperactive. By age 10, he was a problem because he was doing things like pulling the legs off beetles. He once attempted to set fire to the dog, and he started burning his own hands by age 12. In addition, he was also relatively isolative. He began drinking to excess. He was in a private school. His grandfather gave so much money to the school over the years that the school kept on letting Peter get away with not being terminated. Christopher not being terminated. So he grew up in a system in which there were very few rules that he couldn't control or manipulate. And he developed a fair degree of sociopathy. He came down when the mother brought the family with Peter and they relocated to Florida. There was the mother with her new relationship with this father from the extremely wealthy family. There are 4 children. There is Jennifer and her 3 siblings. Christopher comes down to meet his new step siblings. What follows from that is the building of a relationship between Christopher, who I think was 21 or 22 at the time, 21 I think, and the 13-year-old Jennifer. They become sexual. It's hidden for about a year and a half, or about a year. Then the parents find out about it. Jennifer's mother, is very upset. She wants it terminated. However, Christopher's mother thinks that Jennifer is wonderful. She's religious, she's intelligent, she's pretty, she's now 14 and a half. And with the influence of that vast amount of money and the influence of Christopher's father, who doesn't want his son to be identified as a pedophile and therefore needs to keep it quiet, he persuades Susan to just chill, go along with the program. Christopher is an exceptionally manipulative young man. What follows is a situation in which he has had a lot of failure with women. Not surprisingly. He decides that he is going to solve this problem of Jennifer being the love of his life and never leave and require that she never leave him. And he decides that the way he's going to do that is that he is going to become her guide to God. He does this because he sees that in the church that she was from, that you can really manipulate those people, he told me. They are so ready to believe anything. So what he did was he started to present to her slowly the premise that it was up to her to convert him to believe in God. That she was the person who was going to have the power to change him to be the man that she had to have. That was a very great responsibility for a 15-year-old. But she embarked upon it, and he would allow her to spend hours with him, introducing him to the Bible. Now, parenthetically, it may be clear, he had no belief in God, and he had no interest in the Bible. He wanted to use this vehicle solely to get to manipulate her mind. Eventually, at age 18, he became pretty successful. And he decided that now what he needed to do was, in order to really capture her forever, he needed to make sure that she felt the complete power of God that he was claiming that he felt. Because he had bought into a conceptual paradox that in order to really advance their relationship, now it had gone to the point where she had introduced him to God and she'd acquired that power. Now, what he had to do was to cause her to believe that God was now talking to her directly as a result of his efforts to communicate to God that that God now should directly speak to her, because that would give him the ultimate power, because he was so now powerful that he could introduce God to the believer who had converted him, thus ultimately giving him greater power than she could ever otherwise have. Is it pathological enough yet? So, what he begins to do is tell her, teach her, that God is going to start to talk with you one day, just as he has started to talk with me. I can hear him. He has told me that it is ultimately you that's going to be his princess. He used words like this. And so, over the next year or so, we have the induction of this constant conviction that God is going to start talking to her. Initially, she doesn't believe it. And she says, that would be wonderful, but I can't believe this was going to happen. I can't believe that I was so chosen. This is not all that much different from Mother Mary. So she resists initially, but then she finds the concept just so appealing. She gets pregnant. Excuse me. She gets pregnant. By the time she is pregnant, she's 21 when she's pregnant. No, 21 she's pregnant. By that point, she was starting to believe that she was having interesting experiences, vaguely hallucinatory phenomena. She would see lights on the ceiling that didn't exist. She was hearing muffled voices that nobody else could hear. What was actually occurring was that as a result of the induction of all of these massive beliefs and her alienation from virtually everybody else, she was starting to lose perspective, become mentally aberrant in some very subtle ways. Now, if you spoke with her back then, you would hear a consuming commitment to religiosity, spoken hours a day. But otherwise, a relatively normal person, except very isolated, very naive because of social isolation. The father was Christopher. The biological father was of when she became pregnant, Christopher was the father. They were living together. They had been since she was 15. He permitted her to go to school. He drove her there and drove her home. What then happens is that he decides that with the baby coming, now is the time to keep her with him forever. He starts to tell her that any day now, she is going to start hearing God's voice, and God will tell her that it is Christopher who has authorized her to be spoken to directly by God. Well, lo and behold, there comes a point during the pregnancy where she starts hearing voices. Initially, very quietly in her head, seems not really like voices. Seems like almost thought insertions or her own thoughts. It's not where it ends up. She starts to believe that she's hearing the direct communication from God, and he is telling her various sorts of things. He's telling her that she has been a chosen one. And Christopher confirms that he knew that she was going to be told that she was going to be the chosen one. And the evidence for that was that Christopher was convinced that that would be true and that God would recognize that just as he had many years before. A little bit of sociopathy there. End result, she starts interpreting in a mental state phenomena as speech from God. What then happens is the baby is born, and she is a great mother. She is consummately devoted to the child. But then Christopher decides that he needs to test her faith and her faith to him. And he raises the question about whether, in fact, God might test her in some ways, because he's thinking that he's going to develop a test. Hasn't worked out what it's going to be yet, but he wants to test her to be sure that God has her under power so that he will always have her under his power. Unfortunately, he misjudged the nature of the test. What happened was, Jennifer began hearing voices, God's voice, instruct her that she needed to do various things as parts of a test. And when she did these various things, she would be blessed. And in fact, she did hear various instructions from God telling her to do various things. Some of them were simple things. Some of them were to read the Bible for 3 hours a day. Simple. She did it. Eventually, however, when the baby was 10 months old, she was given another test. One night, about 6 o'clock in the evening, while Christopher was flat out on his bed drunk, and her younger sister was in the home, God instructed her. She heard a commandment that she was to test her faith. And the way she was to do this was to throw the baby down on the stones. And if she did that, the baby would be born again as Lazarus was. And hence, this would be the ultimate proof of her love for God, her love for Christopher, and the baby would be the test of that proof. She resisted that voice for 2 days. Then, on the 3rd day, she felt an uncontrollable urge to follow the instructions from God, partly because God had been mocking her, and because Christopher had been mocking her lack of conviction. Christopher, however, had no knowledge of what God was telling her to do. He was too busy being intoxicated. And so initially she placed the baby down on the ground. But then God mocked her and said, how can you claim to love me and love your husband if this is the strength of your will to honor my request of you? Pretty hard to resist that force. The baby was dead by the time the emergency medical services arrived, brain damage. And 2.5 hours later, she was in the local jail, charged with murder. Over the course of the next 2 years, I did a very comprehensive examination of her. There were more than 20 hours of which involved video taping of the process, because I knew that it was very likely that once she was in detention and away from some of these forces, that what had become a brief psychotic process might start to break down, and that she would start to not be seen to be anywhere near as impaired as she was. And we needed to capture that material because this was going to be a not guilty by reason of insanity case. 2 years later, in fact, that's the way the court ruled, even though the state had hired a psychiatrist out of Texas, who's sometimes known as Dr. Death, and he ultimately, although we disagreed about precisely what the diagnosis was, the disagreement was really incidental to the fact that both of us agreed that the condition was not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, interestingly, Jennifer then spent the next 2.5 years in a psychiatric hospital, and I have continued to follow her up over the next 5 years thereafter. I've been involved in this case for 9 years, just about 10 now. Paradoxically, by 9 months into her detention, there was absolutely no indication of any psychotic process operating, and there had not been for about 2 to 3 months, and that persisted. She was able to, with some good assistance and rational cognitive restructuring, ultimately come to understand what had happened. Today, although she has guilt about the loss of the baby, she doesn't feel all that badly about her acts in it because she was so disconnected from the whole thing. Her greatest dilemma today is that as a result of the hideousness of what happened, she can't work in the child welfare system, and that's what she would love to do, because although she's allegedly not guilty by reason of insanity, no agency wants to take the responsibility of hiring somebody who'd killed their 10-month-old baby. And so she, and what she wants to do, and she's just completed her undergraduate degree. I'm not sure that I think this is exactly the best thing for her, but she wants to be a psychologist. And you know what? She'll probably work it out to do just that because she's extremely bright. And as a result of the vast wealth of some of the family, a settlement was ultimately reached, a civil settlement was reached between Christopher and her that will provide her with enough money to be able to support herself for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, while she's doing well, Christopher has gone on and had a series of brides come over from Russia. They tend to stay very short periods of time. But although there's a little amusement in some of this, clearly this is an example of the capacity to induce insanity in an otherwise relatively normal brain and a normal person who gets distorted within family systems that are themselves extremely pathological. But although she was emotionally vulnerable, although she was, if you like, emotionally fragile, she didn't ever need to become psychotic. The psychosis was induced by the craziness of another human being. Now, the French have known about the induction of delusional disorder going back to the 18th century. The folie à deux concept, the notion, and of course in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders today, we call it shared delusional disorder. That is the introduction of a delusional process in the mind of another person induced by a person of influence or power. Unfortunately, in the case of Jennifer, what started off as a delusion became more than a delusion. It became a full-blown psychosis involving auditory hallucinations. Now, the French also talk about the concept, going back to the 18th century, about the concept of a shared delusion that extends throughout a family, where a family member, typically a father or mother, induces or introduces a belief system that is truly delusional. I have myself at times, in looking at the entire question of parental alienation, wondered about whether I thought it was necessary to introduce a concept of parental alienation syndrome into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or whether in fact maybe we could live with the delusional, the concept of shared delusion. I ultimately concluded, after a lot of thought, that we really do need a better portrayal of exactly what's happening in parental alienation syndrome and parental alienation to emerge, even if we don't diagnose it as a separate mental illness, but we incorporate it within the framework of the relational disorders category. And I actually think that perhaps that's perhaps where it's best placed. I'm now going to give you another example of the induction of great mental illness in a child, and the absurdity in some respects of how far some of this stuff can go, and the extent to which the courts are so often ineffective in managing it. By the way, Joe, how much time do I have left? Joe? About 15 minutes. This is a case involving, this is a Canadian case. It occurred in Vancouver, British Columbia, and it involved a family, a wife and 3 children. The reason that they were living in Vancouver, British Columbia, was that the father had stolen a little over $20 million in the United States and was wanted on tax evasion, and as a result thereof had fled to Canada in order to try and prevent himself from being extradited to face a series of charges involving conspiracy. It was RICO statute, racketeering issues, etc., etc. So he was living in Canada. He was a 42-year-old man who married a 22-year-old bride, and she gave him 3 children. When the youngest child was 1 year of age, they relocated to Canada to, as I said, avoid or hope to avoid the legal consequences. That was approximately 20 years ago. What happened was that he became abusive. And eventually, after a fair bit of physical abuse and a great deal of emotional abuse, he and his wife separated. He was an extremely controlling and abusive person. And he was very concerned with this separation, that because there was litigation going on, the US authorities were trying to extradite him. And so long as he had been married to this young lady, she was a Canadian citizen, he thought he was in good shape against the extradition. So, once they separated and were getting a divorce, he became concerned that the criminal litigation may proceed against him, no matter how much money he had and spent. So what he did was he set about to capture his oldest daughter, so that by keeping her, he would be able to protect himself, because the Canadian authorities, in fact, may not allow the extradition of a man who was not a Canadian citizen, but who was an American citizen, but who had a Canadian child. And in fact, that's some of the legal advice that he was given. So he set about to capture the mind of this child. And by the time I got involved in the case, he was doing a pretty good job. The child was 6 years of age at the time that I got involved in the case. She hated her mother. Her mother could do no good. She could talk about the extent to which mother made homemade jam out of the garden, how mother was a good cook, and that mother did various things well. But other than having certain talents that related to cooking, she was of no value. This process, the mother subsequently married another man and relocated back to the United States. And she took the 2 youngest children with her because he was ready to allow them to leave, but not the oldest one. And he was prepared to fight endlessly, and she didn't have the financial resources, etc., etc. So she surrendered to that wish, not understanding what was going to happen to her child. Fast forward. He does such a fine job of controlling this child and convincing her that her mother is basically little beyond pond scum, that the child, but he also doesn't manage the child. By age 10, she is roaming the streets. By age 12, she's having sex and doing drugs. By age 14, she has had an abortion. Meanwhile, he's having some health problems. And she brings home, she finds some drugs in the house. Now, he's been taking a lot of prescription drugs because he's pretty pathological himself. He's got major depression issues. He's got some health concerns. He also has pain. He starts taking relatively large doses of pain-killing medication. And he starts agreeing to allow her to go and get street drugs for him, specifically cocaine. So he agrees that he will support his daughter's cocaine habit if she manages it and keeps it under control. Anybody know a 15-year-old with the capacity to have a cocaine habit and manage it and keep it under control? She lives through his prostitutions, his women coming into the 3-bedroom apartment, the 18 and 19 and 20 and 21-year-old women that he brings home. That he simply actually doesn't bring them home. He phones in and has them delivered. Might suspect that this child is no longer in school. He becomes profoundly addicted to cocaine. He is now mixing cocaine and alcohol. He is also still using antidepressants. She is now tendering to him, nursing him, because he is so sick and because she is the only person in the world who he trusts to care for him. The manipulation extends to her being, for 2 years, almost completely isolated, except to go out and supply drugs, acquire drugs for him. One day, lying in the same bed with him at night, though there appears to have never been anything sexual between them, at least in a physical sense, he stops breathing and dies from a drug overdose. He is 61 years of age. She is devastated. She cannot imagine life without her father, who she's been caring for 2 years. She falls into a major depression. She attempts to kill herself. She does not succeed. And I get a call again. We hospitalize her. Fortunately, he left more than $7 million. He'd only gone through 10 or 12. And with that $7 million, he also died without a will. But the Canadian authorities sold the home that he was living in And the money was kept in trust for the children. And fortunately, I got to help them spend a little bit of it in regard to her care. And we worked very conscientiously to deprogram her in a hospital setting. The deprogramming took a long time because she was so depressed at the time that I first saw her that we had, it wasn't simply we had a minor mental illness here. I am genuinely concerned that this young woman may not make it, because now she is living with the recognition that her whole existence was based on a lie, and she is so very fragile and so extremely depressed. She has no sense of of the potential of having a future, because she's never had one. And it is extremely difficult from a therapeutic standpoint to go back and to go forward and try and create the social learning that she missed out on by being in such a profoundly dysfunctional relationship. My point in offering these two stories is to note that simply psychopathology exists in many different forms, and one of the ways that it emerges is through the induction, sometimes the intentional, sometimes the incompetent induction of the events, the influence of other people. It can become psychotic. It can become less than psychotic, but otherwise profound. In the case of the parental alienation presentation that I've just made, I still think that this young woman's life is very much still on the line, even after several years of professional care. All right, thank you very much.